Today, June 12th, marks the World Day Against Child Labour. It is a day started by the International Labour Organization in 2002, aimed at raising awareness and activism to prevent child labour. This year, celebrating the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Worst Forms of Child Labour Convention, the theme is Let's Act on Our Commitments, End Child Labour. So to learn more about this issue today, I'm honoured to say that we have a special guest with us for our in-depth. We have with us the head of the UNICEF Seoul Liasion Office, Oren Schlein. Mr. Schlein, hello and thank you for stopping by today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so let us actually start with the very basics. Can you explain for us what child labour would be exactly? How would we define it?
Certainly. Let me begin with the definition provided by the International Labour Organization. ILO refers to child labour as work that deprives children, which is any person under the age of 18, of their childhood, their potential, their dignity, and that is harmful to their physical and their mental development. And that's quite important. We'll come back to that in a moment. Child labour is prohibited under international law under two conventions, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the ILO Conventions on the minimum age of employment and the worst forms of child labor. Now, if I could just add that from a UNICEF perspective, we view child labor in four ways. One, depriving children of the right to education, which deprives them of the opportunity to reach their full potential, increasing children's vulnerability to exploitation, abuse, and trafficking, causing bodily and mental harm through exposure of children to hazardous working conditions, and lastly, perpetuating cycles of poverty.
All right, some key words there I would say is deprivation, vulnerability, and harm. How many children in the world are in child labour? Do we have the numbers? And why do they work? How do they end up in their situation?
Certainly. According to a child labour report prepared by UNICEF and ILO in 2020, nearly 1 in 10 children are subjected to child labor worldwide, with some forced into hazardous work through trafficking. That's roughly 160 million children.
So 1 in 10?
1 in 10.
Okay.
And this is 4 years ago, and the numbers keep going up. And there's, of course, the impact of COVID on top of that. Nearly half that number, 80 million children, work in hazardous environments. And that's environments that endanger their health, safety, and moral development. And just to give you a few examples, just geographically, Africa ranks highest, both in terms of the percentage of incidents of child labor and the number. So 1/5 of all children in Africa, or about 92 million children. In Asia and the Pacific, these regions rank number 2, 5.6% of all children, about 49 million. And in the Americas and Europe and Central Asia, about 8 million in both of those two regions and 2.5 million in the Arab states. So, the problem is quite pervasive.
Indeed, and we've often heard about child labour being used in industries such as the clothing and fashion, but actually, what are the most common industries or sectors where child labour is prevalent, and perhaps most importantly, what are the conditions like for children in these sectors?
It's actually it's a fascinating question, because most children in child labor actually work within their own family unit. And conditions vary quite significantly. You might have children who are selling goods on street corners. Some undertake household chores. Some work on farms. Others work in factories, or they work in mines. So the environment or the conditions under which children work vary quite considerably. The agricultural sector represents about 70% of all child labor worldwide. The service industry is about 20%, and the manufacturing industry 10%. And just a few other examples. If you look at specific sectors, the coffee and cocoa bean plantation is a very, very big problem that we face in the child labor area. Harvesting sugarcane, cotton, working in sweatshops, and so on and so forth.
Right, so when we think about child labour, I think maybe people would be thinking about sweatshops, as you said, or perhaps farms, but you're saying it can range widely from household work as well and general farming. Okay, so with that in mind then, what are the concerns? You mentioned earlier about how it can have an effect on their physical and mental health, as well as their education and future opportunities. How does child labour affect children in these ways?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that tens of millions of children around the world are exposed to toxic chemicals. So you can imagine the serious health risks experienced by children who work in these labor conditions. Children are particularly vulnerable to environmental hazards for several reasons. First, their physical size. They've got developing bodies. There's a lack of knowledge about existing threats in their environments. And I think the key point is both the physical and the mental implications and impacts of child labor are something that are quite critical. I mentioned the agricultural sector, where you've got tens of millions of children that are widely exposed to direct contact with pesticides, for instance. Children who work in small-scale gold mines are exposed to toxic heavy metals like mercury and lead, and that can lead to brain and neurological disorders. And then, of course, we discussed children working in garment and footwear industries, and also those involved in informal recycling of electronic waste. These children work in very, very significant, challenging environments that impact their health and development.
Right. And as you mentioned as well earlier, it's not just their physical and well-being, but I'm sure it affects their mental well-being. And also we talked about education and future opportunities as well. I'm guessing because they're working, those opportunities become limited.
Yeah, well, that's exactly correct. And so it becomes a bit of a virtuous cycle, if you will. On the one hand, you need children work because they need to bring money in for their families. So if I can retake that one, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, it affects not just their mental and physical health, but it can affect their opportunities in, for example, education and other opportunities as well, I'm assuming.
That's correct. And I think the key point here is that poverty, while it's a significant driver of child labor, it's influenced by many factors, including lack of education, lack of health care, inadequate access to social services. And so we speak of the poverty and child labor cycle, where basically children, instead of going to school, they miss out on education and skills development. And as they grow up, they become illiterate child laborers as adults. And that basically perpetuates the cycle for future generations.
Right, so poverty is a major factor then in causing the environment where child labor occurs. So then can high economic growth, on the other hand, then, through globalization, solve this sort of problem?
Well, it's another interesting question. You would think so, but in actual fact, that has not proven to be the case. In fact, child labor has increased due to globalization, due to several reasons. Deregulation of labor markets, increased competition, disregard for human and environmental consequences. There's also increased demand for cheap labor that's related to the increased competition. And urban poverty also leads to increase in child labor. All of these factors lead to lower wages, poor working conditions, and lower safety standards for child laborers, both in developing countries as well as industrialized countries.
Interesting. Okay, so high economic growth is not the solution to everything, it seems, then. So then let's talk about what organizations like yourself have been doing. What is UNICEF doing to perhaps help mitigate and tackle child labor? Can you share with us perhaps some stories or case studies where UNICEF and their intervention have significantly reduced or eliminated child labor in certain regions?
Sure, certainly, absolutely. And let me first add, we've spoken a little bit about the broader kind of child labor issue. It is a fact that the data does show that more boys are impacted than girls, but girls face a very unique triple burden of school, work, and household chores. So they do not have access to school. They have to work. They're doing household chores. And this actually heightens their risk of falling behind, making them much more vulnerable to poverty and exclusion. Let me give kind of two sets of brief examples, if I might.
Okay.
One, a few areas of work where UNICEF is tackling the child labor issue. And then secondly, I'll give you two or three very quick case studies and stories. First of all, in terms of the areas that we work, the first thing we try to do is we try to strengthen the social service workforce. We train social service workers who play a very important role in both recognizing, preventing, and managing risks that can lead to child labor. And we do this in most of the countries where we work. UNICEF has a presence in over 150 countries and territories. Secondly, we address harmful social norms. And what I mean by that is that we work with parenting groups and communities to make them aware of the very unique challenges that children face when they do enter the workforce, all the issues that we spoke about earlier. Thirdly, we partner with governments, both national governments as well as at the local level. And here it's largely about changing policies, but also increasing the awareness of the importance of preventing the cycle that we've spoken about and preventing violence, exploitation, and abuse that's associated with child labor.
Right.
So things, principles and ideas that might seem obvious to us are not necessarily obvious to all communities.
Right, and then, so working from the community level all the way up to government level.
Absolutely. And then the last point in this sort of bucket of examples is our work with businesses. It's really important that we influence responsible business practices, working with businesses to make them aware of the issues and how they can change their own business practices and those along their supply chains that impact children and their families. Now, if I have just a brief moment to give a couple very specific case studies.
Sure.
So, in India, in recent years, we've supported the National Child Labor Project, which has helped thousands of children stop work and return to school. And there's a story of a 6-year-old boy named Shabiyullah who worked 10 hours a day as a helper on a roadside tea stall. And he frequently burnt his hands with boiling water. He earned all of 10 rupees a day, which is about 20 American cents. And because of our intervention and the work that we did at the community level as well, he no longer sells tea. He's now back in school. He has made up the years of lost education, completing 5 school grades in just 3 years. And he's just one story amongst thousands. In Costa Rica, on the other part of the world, we've worked very closely with the Costa Rican Coffee Institute to promote the House of Joy initiative. We've been doing this for about a decade now to create a safe and nurturing space for children while their parents harvest coffee beans. And so that creates a protective environment for them. And this has actually had quite some significant impact on the lives of 2,000 children in Costa Rica.
Wow, so from India all the way to Costa Rica, UNICEF is having an impact, it seems. So then there are real solutions that can be reached to help tackle this issue, it seems. So then how can perhaps individuals and communities contribute to this fight against child labour? What can you perhaps tell our listeners about how they can get involved as well?
Sure. So we've spoken a bit already about community engagement, and I think that really is where it all begins. It's all about sensitizing people to the issues and how we need to effect change from the ground up. It's about designing and implementing parenting initiatives, community education initiatives. Again, bring everybody along on a journey, if you will, and not really seeing this as the remit of one particular part of society or another. So a lot of it is around information sharing. A lot of it is around behavior change. Our country programs strengthen community engagement and education by supporting communities, for instance, to monitor school enrollment rates and attendance rates. So it's also about understanding what numbers of children are either in school or out of school and identifying those children. There's one very small example which is a little bit similar to the India example I gave earlier. In the African country of Gabon, we worked with NGOs and government to stop 20 girls and boys from undertaking excessive household chores. So they basically were kept out of school to work at home. Simple things that to us might seem rather innocuous: cleaning, babysitting, cooking, laundry, washing trucks for the community. But in actual fact, we were able, again, working with local community groups, to change community perceptions of child labor, to get these children to stop working, and now they're all back in school. And again, one example amongst many. So I think the key point here is that children, families, individuals, communities, we all need to work together to really ensure that we have the right child protection systems in place to stop child labor.
Yes, I'm sure this is an issue that will take a long time to tackle, but I guess with steps, steps like you've mentioned, small steps to big steps and efforts to spread awareness and it can hopefully be accelerated so that child labour can be ended a day sooner as well. And finally, while we have you here with us today, I know we focused today's interview on the issue of child labour, but we also wanted to talk about a little about what UNICEF has been doing with the South Korean government during your time in Seoul as the head of UNICEF's Liaison Office here. You've been here for 3 years now, I believe. Can you tell us about what work you've been doing and how the relationship with South Korea and UNICEF has been evolving during that time?
Thank you very much for that question. You know, as you and your listeners probably know, UNICEF and Korea have a long-standing relationship going back to the end of the Korean War. Korea is the only country who's graduated from being a donor recipient to a major donor in its own right. And we hear a lot of this term, the global pivotal state, which has been coined by the UN administration, and it really kind of acknowledges the importance that the South Korean government is placing on its role as a country that has learned through its own development sort of story, if you will, and they want to give back. And so one of the interesting things that we've observed is official development assistance is increasing annually at exponential rates, in fact, faster than any other OECD country. ODA has doubled in the last 5 years. It's currently at $4.8 billion. So, on the one hand, you've got a Korean government that is very, very keen to expand its presence overseas, as well as its collaboration with organizations like my own and other UN organizations as well. As I mentioned earlier, we work in 150 countries and territories. And, what we've managed to do over the past 3 years, our organization, along with the Korean government, is really expand that portfolio, expand the areas of work that we're engaged in. I would say the 5 big areas that we're working on are humanitarian assistance, climate action, education, global health, and digital transformation. And if I could just make one particular mention of a very exciting climate initiative that we launched with KOICA, the Korean Development Agency, a couple of weeks ago. The Korean government and the head of UNICEF agreed about a year ago that we would prioritize climate as the number one issue in our partnership, because climate affects all children everywhere. And so we've just launched this groundbreaking 10-year partnership that's going to try to really impact the lives of millions of children around the world, beginning in Asia and in Africa, really by making social services, that's the healthcare services, the education services, access to water and sanitation, more climate resilient and more able to respond to the needs of children in this changing environment.
We're out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there, but we very much appreciate you coming in to tell us about what UNICEF has been doing. We've been speaking to Oren Schlein, head of the UNICEF Liaison Office in Seoul. Thank you once again for your time today.
Thank you very much.